Welcome to Hopetales, where ordinary people face impossible situations, and hope becomes the greatest hero. Today's story will take you 38,000 feet above the ground, into a storm where every second counts, and where a little girl holds the key to saving 200 lives. Flight 782 lifted off from the runway under a calm, golden sky. The aircraft climbed smoothly, engines humming in perfect rhythm, passengers settling into their seats with the usual mix of excitement and routine. The world outside the windows slowly faded into deep blue as the plane reached cruising altitude. Nothing hinted that within the next hour, every soul on board would be standing on the thin line between life and death. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere felt normal. A mother gently helped her daughter fasten her seatbelt. A businessman reviewed pages of documents. A group of tourists shared quiet laughs. And among them sat a small, quiet 12-year-old girl in a window seat near the wing. Her backpack rested on her lap, filled with colored pencils, and a folded sheet of paper she had been drawing since the airport. A sketch of mountains, the sun, and a winding river that shimmered in her imagination. Forward in the cockpit, the aircraft sliced through calm skies. The captain monitored the instruments while the first officer handled the routine checklists. Everything operated smoothly, until a faint vibration began to creep through the floor. It was subtle, barely noticeable, the kind of tremor no passenger would ever feel. But in the cockpit, a shift this small never went ignored. The sky ahead darkened faster than expected. Patches of clouds began to form unusual shapes, sharp edges, towering peaks, clusters folding into each other like rising smoke. The radar showed nothing alarming, and yet something felt off. The flight crossed into a region where air patterns behaved strangely, a place known for unpredictable storms that built themselves silently and struck suddenly. But at that moment, nothing appeared dangerous enough to change course. Passengers continued their routines. The small girl leaned her head against the window, watching the horizon melt into stormy shades. She noticed the sun disappearing behind a thick layer of clouds, its orange outline swallowed slowly until only a faint glow remained. She took out her drawing and added more strokes of red and purple, capturing the changing sky. Then it happened. Without warning, every screen in the cockpit flickered, dimmed, and went completely black. The sound of the engines remained, but the lifeline of the aircraft, its instruments, navigation, altitude readings, flight controls display, vanished in an instant. The cockpit fell into a ghostly darkness, broken only by a weak emergency glow. No alarms, no warnings, no explanations. It was as if the sky had simply decided to mute the aircraft. The pilots tried to regain systems, but nothing responded. Not a single button, not a switch, not a backup monitor. The aircraft was now flying blind at 38,000 feet, surrounded by a storm, forming faster than any weather chart had predicted. In the cabin, the passengers felt the first jolt. A sudden drop in altitude made their seat belts pull tight against their bodies. Drinks tilted, overhead lights flickered, and the sound of wind grew louder. People looked around, confused, sensing that something was very wrong. No announcement came from the cockpit, and that silence alone was terrifying. The young girl's pencil rolled off her tray as the plane shook again. She grabbed her drawing quickly, holding it close, her eyes scanning the darkening clouds outside. Something about them felt familiar, like the shapes she had drawn earlier without realizing why. In the cockpit, the pilots fought the controls, trying to stabilize the plane manually. But the turbulence grew fierce. Winds slammed against the fuselage, pushing the aircraft off its path. Without instruments, they had no idea which direction they were drifting, how fast they were descending, or how close dangerous terrain might be. The storm grew thicker, turning the world outside into a swirling wall of gray. Lightning flashed on both sides of the aircraft, illuminating the chaos for split seconds. Each flash revealed the narrow escape routes between towering storm cells, gaps that needed exact timing and precise flying, something nearly impossible without instruments. Another violent shake ripped through the plane. Passengers gasped, clutching armrests. Overhead bins rattled, cabin lights dimmed, and oxygen masks trembled slightly in their compartments as if preparing to drop. Amid the rising fear, the small girl pressed her drawing against her chest, her heart pounding. She stared at the sun she had drawn. the bright circle in the sketch that sat between two mountain-like shapes. She looked outside again, watching the faint glow of the real sun trying to push through the storm's edges. She didn't understand why, but something about the light, the shapes of the clouds, and the direction the plane was shaking in felt connected to her drawing. The aircraft banked unexpectedly to the left, causing trays and loose items to slide. The captain held the yoke with both hands, relying solely on instincts and years of experience. But flying blind through a storm of this magnitude was nearly impossible. The storm's core was pulling the aircraft inward like a whirlpool, and without screens. The pilots didn't know how close they were to the most dangerous part. The turbulence worsened. Passengers braced themselves as the aircraft dipped sharply, the cabin echoing with gasps and muffled cries. A sense of helplessness spread through the plane, a silent understanding that something catastrophic was unfolding. The small girl lifted her drawing again, staring at the lines she had made earlier at the airport, the odd shape of the mountains, the position of the sun, the curve of the river. She looked back outside. The clouds, strangely, mirrored those exact shapes. The glow of the sun aligned where she had placed it in her sketch. It felt impossible yet undeniable. It was as though her drawing wasn't a fantasy, but a map. The storm roared louder around the aircraft, pushing it deeper into danger. The pilots still had no instruments, no direction, no guidance. And in the middle of that chaos, the only person who unknowingly held the first clue to survival was the little girl with the drawing clutched in her hands. The aircraft shuddered violently as it plunged into the heart of the storm. Outside, dark clouds twisted into jagged towers, each flash of lightning revealing a chaotic swirl of air currents. The once calm sky had transformed into a raging battlefield, testing both the metal and the human spirit aboard Flight 782. Inside the cockpit, the pilots fought desperately to maintain control. Every instinct honed over years of experience screamed at them, yet the absence of instruments left them blind. They relied solely on feel, the subtle vibrations through the yoke, the shift of pressure under their hands, the sound of the engines, attempting to guide 200 lives through nature's wrath. Each decision carried a weight heavier than any they had known before. In the cabin, passengers gripped their seats, knuckles white, hearts hammering. The turbulence grew sharper, tossing belongings and straining overhead bins. Fear rippled through the crowd in waves. Mothers held their children tightly. Adults muttered prayers under their breath. A few passengers pressed their faces against the windows, desperate to gauge what awaited outside. Amid the chaos, the young girl clutched her drawing, her small fingers tracing the lines of mountains and rivers she had sketched hours earlier. A strange calm had settled over her, contrasting sharply with the panic around her. She studied the storm outside the window, comparing it with the shapes in her drawing. The peaks of clouds mirrored the mountains she had drawn. The faint orange glow of the sun echoed her sketch. She could not understand why, but somehow her eyes recognized a path where the pilots could not. Back in the cockpit, a bolt of lightning illuminated the cabin in stark white, casting fleeting shadows across the instruments. The pilots flinched at the brightness. But it also revealed subtle visual cues, the position of the horizon, the tilt of the wings, that they used to make split-second adjustments. The plane lurched violently, banking dangerously, then corrected itself, inching forward through the storm. The storm seemed to react to every movement of the aircraft, gusts striking unpredictably, like nature testing the limits of human skill. The plane entered a zone where the wind currents twisted and collided, producing sudden updrafts and downdrafts. Each one was a gamble. Too little adjustment and the aircraft could spiral. Too much and it might lose balance. In the cabin, the passengers' fear had reached a fever pitch. A tray table toppled, spilling a half-drunk cup of coffee onto the seat below. A woman's scarf fluttered like a flag caught in the wind. The aircraft creaked under pressure, groaning in protest, every sound amplified by tension. Some passengers closed their eyes, trying to detach from the reality around them, while others held on to loved ones as though their touch could anchor them in safety. The young girl continued to observe, almost imperceptibly guiding her gaze along the storm's gaps. Each flash of lightning, each shadow of a cloud, reminded her of the lines in her drawing. She tilted her head slightly, noting how the peaks aligned. with the horizon and how a faint glow indicated the safest path forward. She did not know that her innocent observation was slowly forming a mental map, a map that could guide the plane to safety. Time became fluid inside the storm. Seconds stretched into minutes, each jolt making hearts pound faster, each lightning strike creating a temporary clarity. The pilots adjusted as best they could, the aircraft responding to minute corrections. But the unpredictability of the storm made every second a life or death. Decision suddenly, a violent downburst caught the plane, forcing it into a sharp dive. Passengers screamed, the cabin rattling in protest. Overhead lights flickered. Emergency signs glowed briefly, and the oxygen masks dangled in anticipation. The pilots wrestled with the controls, struggling to regain stability, muscles tense and eyes scanning for any hint of horizon. From her seat, the young girl watched carefully. She noticed a subtle break in the storm, a faint ribbon of light slicing through the clouds, almost invisible. It mirrored the gap she had drawn on her paper hours before. Without understanding why, she pointed subtly with her pencil toward it. She pressed her lips together, heart pounding, knowing instinctively that this was the path to safety, the one the pilots could not see amidst the darkness. In the cockpit, the captain felt a sudden shift in the aircraft's behavior. The plane responded to his adjustments with slightly more stability. He could not understand why, but something seemed to guide them through the worst of the turbulence. His hands gripped the yoke tightly, muscles trembling with fatigue, sweat rolling down his forehead. Every movement mattered. Every small correction could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Lightning flashed again, and for a moment, the young girl's drawing, illuminated in the cabin light. A simple guide to a path through chaos. She did not know that what she had created was now, unknowingly, a blueprint for survival. The storm continued its relentless assault, but something had changed. A subtle rhythm emerged, a pattern the pilots could sense without instruments. The aircraft responded more smoothly, finding narrow channels between violent gusts. It was almost as if the storm itself had allowed a moment of grace, giving human determination a chance to prove stronger than fear. Inside the cabin, passengers clung to hope, each brief moment of calm reinforcing the fragile belief that survival was possible. Mothers whispered words of reassurance to their children. Travelers whispered prayers, and hearts began to beat in cautious unison with the plane's controlled movements. Flight 782 had emerged from the first waves of the storm, but the battle was far from over. Outside, clouds still churned violently, lightning flashing sporadically against the dark sky. The pilots' hands were raw, muscles trembling from constant adjustments. Yet their determination did not falter. Every movement of the yoke was deliberate, every ounce of focus a testament to survival. Inside the cabin, passengers clung to their seats, hearts pounding, breaths shallow. Fear was still present, but a subtle undercurrent of hope had begun to ripple through the aircraft. They had survived the worst of the first assault, and something intangible suggested they might survive the second. The young girl sat quietly, her eyes glued to the storm outside. Her drawing lay open on her lap, the colored peaks and the tiny orange sun glowing faintly in the cabin light. Every flash of lightning seemed to mirror her sketch, each movement of the clouds aligning with the shapes she had drawn hours ago. Her small hands trembled, but she instinctively traced the lines again, almost as if she could guide the plane with her fingertips. The captain and first officer continued their battle in the cockpit. They had found a rhythm, a fragile connection between instinct and experience, but they were flying blind in every sense. There were no instruments, no screens, and the storm still raged around them. Every decision carried the weight of 200 lives. Each correction had to be precise, or the consequences could be catastrophic. The turbulence became more localized, forming pockets of violent air that threatened to rip the aircraft off course. One sudden gust pitched the plane sharply, causing trays to fall, overhead bins to rattle, and passengers to gasp in panic. The pilots struggled to regain control, eyes scanning the narrow, visible horizon for any sign of safe passage. Meanwhile, the girl noticed a pattern forming. The break in the storm she had seen before had shifted slightly, and another narrow opening appeared between two towering clouds. She traced it with her finger, her heart racing, her mind unaware of how her observation could be the difference between life and death. She realized that the glow of the sun outside indicated the safest orientation, a subtle tilt that could guide the aircraft through the storm's most dangerous segment. The captain felt a sudden, inexplicable clarity. He had been fighting the aircraft for what felt like hours, yet a subtle nudge of instinct told him which way to bank, which way to tilt. The plane responded with a rare smoothness, cutting through the turbulence with minimal oscillation. Something or someone was guiding them, an unseen force offering just enough insight to navigate the storm. Inside the cabin, tension began to shift. Passengers whispered prayers. Some closed their eyes, others stared at the windows, trying to glimpse any sign of safety. The young girl's quiet presence became a subtle anchor, her calmness amid panic somehow giving others courage. Mothers noticed her steadiness and drew strength from it. Unaware of the critical role she was about to play, another wave of turbulence struck. The aircraft pitched and rolled violently, each jolt threatening to tip the fragile balance the pilots had achieved. The first officer shouted instructions, voice tense but controlled, while the captain maneuvered with every ounce of skill. Yet it was clear that instinct alone might not be enough to carry them. Through the next stage of the storm, the young girl's eyes were drawn to the sky outside. She noticed that the lines in her drawing, the peaks, the valleys, the small sun, perfectly corresponded to the gaps between violent clouds. She leaned forward slightly, pointing at the shapes and subtly indicating direction. She did not know that her movements were being noticed from across the cabin, nor did she realize that the pilots, through a moment of sheer chance, caught sight of her gestures. For a fleeting moment, the captain glanced at the cabin through the cockpit's small side window. His eyes fell upon the girl holding her drawing, her small hands tracing the lines as if showing the path. A flicker of realization passed through him, an almost imperceptible feeling that she might be pointing toward the only path through the chaos. Desperation mixed with instinct, and he followed her subtle cues, adjusting the aircraft's bank and tilt accordingly. The plane responded, cutting through the storm more effectively than before. The turbulence remained fierce, yet the aircraft held its course. A narrow beam of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating a safe corridor that aligned perfectly with the girl's drawing. The storm's rage continued, but a fragile channel of hope had emerged. A way forward, carved by observation, instinct, and a child's innocent vision. Passengers began to sense the shift. The violent jolts were slightly less severe. The plane's movements were smoother. They still clung to their seats. But there was a growing awareness that survival was possible. Whispers of relief began to circulate, mingling with prayers and silent thanks. Inside the cockpit, the captain's focus sharpened. The first officer mirrored his adjustments, relying on the subtle guidance that seemed almost mystical. Every turn, every tilt, every minor correction carried them closer to the storm's exit. And with each passing moment, the young girl's drawing had become a silent map, a bridge between panic and survival. Lightning flashed one final time, illuminating the aircraft as it cut through the storm. For the first time in what felt like hours, the plane felt steady, balanced, and controlled. The pilots exchanged a tense, knowing glance. They had navigated the worst of the storm, but they had not yet reached safety. And yet the small girl sat quietly, unaware of the power she held, unaware that her innocent sketch had become the beacon guiding. Flight 782 through its darkest hours. Flight 782 had finally emerged from the storm's most violent heart. But the challenges were far from over. The aircraft still floated hundreds of feet above rugged terrain, mountains jagged beneath a sky streaked with the remnants of storm clouds. The pilots, exhausted yet resolute, knew that the safest landing required careful coordination, precision, and unwavering focus. Each decision was a delicate balance between risk and survival. Inside the cockpit, the captain's hands gripped the yoke tightly. Every motion was deliberate, every adjustment small but critical. The first officer monitored airspeed, angle, and the subtle feedback from the wings. They were flying on instinct and muscle memory, relying on skill honed over years, yet still guided by something intangible, an almost imperceptible thread that had led them through the storm. The young girl, seated quietly near the cockpit door, held her drawing close. She had traced every line, every mountain peak, every ribbon of light that had appeared through the storm. Now, as the clouds began to break, she noticed that the sketch she had made earlier was perfectly aligned with the landscape below. The valleys and peaks on her paper matched the shadows of the terrain illuminated by the sun peeking through the dissipating clouds. Without realizing it, she had created a mental map, a guide that had already steered the plane through the worst of the turbulence. In the cabin, passengers remained tense. They had survived violent jolts, terrifying drops, and the fear of being powerless high above the earth. Yet there was a subtle shift in energy, a quiet, cautious hope. Mothers hugged their children tighter. Travelers whispered silent thanks, and the cabin crew moved with a renewed sense of purpose, guiding passengers toward composure as the plane steadied. The pilots, aware that the most dangerous phase was not the storm but the terrain below, adjusted their approach carefully. Every turn and bank had to avoid mountains, ridges, and cliffs, a task that would have been nearly impossible without precise information. As they navigated the descending path, the captain noticed something extraordinary. Through the small cockpit window, he saw the outline of terrain aligning with a faint light and shadows, and it mirrored a small girl's sketch that rested near the cockpit. A realization struck him. The child's drawing, the one she had been holding so quietly, was not just a simple sketch. It had mirrored the sky, the clouds, and now the land below. Without consciously understanding it, she had observed and internalized patterns that guided the pilots through the storm. Her innocent attention to detail had become a lifeline. The aircraft glided through narrow passes between mountain peaks. The sun, breaking through lingering storm clouds, created ribbons of light that illuminated safe paths. The plane responded with a grace and precision that seemed almost impossible under the circumstances. Passengers began to sense the subtle smoothness in motion, the lessening of turbulence. Their panic softened into a tentative relief, though they still clung to seats and straps, hearts racing with every movement. Finally, the final approach began. The airstrip, a small regional runway nestled between hills, appeared in the distance. The pilots guided the plane carefully, calculating every descent, every angle. The young girl watched quietly, her pencil still in hand. She had no idea that her drawing had been the invisible guide, the silent map that had carried Flight 782 from near disaster to the cusp of safety. Touchdown came in perfect synchronization. The aircraft rolled smoothly along the runway, tires gripping tarmac with controlled precision. The storm's remnants lingered behind, leaving a sky painted in golden and pink hues. Relief erupted inside the cabin. Passengers clapped, whispered thanks, and hugged each other, the tension of hours melting away. The pilots exhaled in unison, muscles trembling but spirits lifted. They had navigated the impossible, relying on instinct, experience, and an inexplicable guiding force. One of them glanced toward the cabin and saw the small girl holding her drawing. A wave of realization washed over him. Her sketch, her observations, had been the invisible compass through the storm. Without her, they might not have made it. The cabin crew moved to reassure passengers. Mothers hugged children, travelers shook hands, and the young girl remained quietly seated, unaware of the magnitude of her contribution. She had acted on intuition, on observation, and on a child's innocent awareness, the very traits that had guided a plane with 200 souls safely to the ground. As the aircraft taxied to its gate, emergency services stood by, ready in case of any complications. But there were none. Flight 782 had survived the impossible, a miracle of human skill and the subtle, unexpected intervention of a small child. In the debrief that followed, investigators would later marvel at the precision with which the aircraft navigated the storm without functional instruments. Pilots would describe the inexplicable moments of guidance, the sudden clarity amid chaos, and only then would the story of the little girl emerge. A quiet, unnoticed hero whose simple sketch had become a map, whose attention to the world around her had saved lives. In the end, Flight 782 was not just a story of survival, it was a story of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, courage, observation, and an unexpected spark, even from the smallest among us, can change everything. And high above the clouds, in the midst of chaos and fear, the little girl had proven that hope can sometimes take the form of something as simple as a pencil, a sheet of paper, and a heart willing to see what others cannot.